Now. Yeah, so welcome everyone. Some of you may have seen me on some other webinars that I've done for Norton Natural, but if this is your first one, welcome. It's great to have you today. My name is Catherine Swinney, and I work for the Kent and Medway Healthy Workplaces program. I'm one of the East Kent Workplace Health Coordinators, and as a bit of context, this program has been supporting Norton Natural School with part of their staff wellbeing efforts. So you may have seen some of these initiatives come up at the beginning of the school year. And in response to that survey that was done at the beginning of the school year, these were some of the topics that were requested. And I'm also joined by my colleague Grace as well, if you want to sort of say hello and introduce yourself, Grace.
Yeah, hi, my name's Grace and I'm a workplace health coordinator on the programme, and I typically cover the Dartford, Gresham and Swanley area. So in a similar role to Catherine, and I've come along to support today.
So we're here together so that way we can kind of help answer any questions that you have. So as we go through the session, I like to keep my sessions relatively informal. So if you do have, a microphone on whatever laptop or computer that you're using, do feel free just to kind of unmute yourself, use the raise hand sort of symbol and just kind of shout it out. Or if you don't have a microphone, or if you prefer, you can just put your question in the chat function as well. And then between Grace and myself, we'll kind of monitor that and try to answer any questions as well. As a little bit of a disclaimer, so in terms of our background, so I went to university for exercise science. I minored in nutrition and psychology, and Grace has actually got her bachelor's in nutrition as well. But so while we've got a pretty good understanding of nutrition, we're not registered dietitians. So within our scope of practice, today's session is really just about giving general advice and tips and recommendations along the way around how our food choices can impact our mood, but equally how our mood can then impact some of those food choices that we make as well, as we see in that eat to live versus live to eat mentality. So we're not able to answer any specific questions about, if you had a specific medical condition and wanted nutrition advice. We're not within our scope of practice to do that. But what we can try to do is give you general recommendations in line with the Eat Well Guide. So that's what we'll cover today. So with that in mind, we're going to look at how our mood can impact our food choices, but then on the converse, look at how our food choices can impact our mood. And there are some specific nutrients specific to food that impact our mood. And so we'll look at those in a little bit more detail, specifically focusing on carbohydrates, protein, vitamins, minerals, hydration. And then we're just going to highlight some sort of tips around how we can look to improve our mood, our relationship with food, and in general, mental well-being. So I've asked in the chat already, and I see we've got a good mix of responses amongst those of attending today, of if you're more of an eat to live or live to eat type of person. And really the distinguish between that is, there's different functions that eating has in our day-to-day lives. So if you're that eat to live, you might sort of appreciate more the practical side that food gives to us, which is that it's there to fuel us. Food is our energy source. So we're there, it's just to help us kind of live out our day and get the nutrients that we need from our food. For those that maybe subscribe more to that live to eat mentality, then you may fall into, you might appreciate some of the other sort of functions that food has in our day-to-day lives, which is that it's a source of comfort. It's oftentimes a lot of, religious and cultural ceremonies and things are surrounded by food. So it's recognizing those aspects to it as well. And that's where we see we've got our eat to live. In general, food is our energy source. It's vital for survival. We need to eat. And that's how it fuels us. That's how we get the energy in the day. But also there are other functions that food has at a cellular level. So at that cellular level, it helps us to grow and repair cells and tissues. That relates to some of the proteins we eat and things. It helps to repair. And then in general, it's going to keep us healthy. So we want to make sure that we're kind of getting all the nutrients that we need through our diet to function properly, not to feel sluggish or lethargic and so on. But like I said, there's those other functions that food has as well, and they're just as important to appreciate. So if you sort of chose, oh, I'm more of an eat to live type of person, or I'm more of a live to eat, it's important to sort of appreciate both when it comes to our relationship with food. So in addition to those sort of practical functionalities, we also want to appreciate that food is there for enjoyment as well, right? I always think if food was solely just, eating to live, then we could just take a pill for the rest of our lives and not not actually enjoy food at all, right? We could just be a robot and just, get the calories that we need to fuel our day. So we want to appreciate that, food can give us a sense of pleasure and enjoyment. Like I said previously, there's lots of sort of religious and cultural traditions that are surrounded by food. So, if we think back to just the most recent sort of New Year's or Christmas, Hanukkah, all those sorts of celebrations, if I was to ask you, what's one of your favorite sort of holiday foods? Well, that might have either a family norm or a family tradition. It might be, your grandmother's recipe, or you might have something else as well. So we want to recognize those sort of connections that food can bring us as well. And then also, again, that nutrient content. There are certain nutrients that are going to impact how we feel about a food as well. So we're going to try to unpick all of that in just about sort of 40-ish minutes left. But from the start, though, what sort of food choices do you tend to make? I'd love for you just to kind of share in the chat, are you more of a sweet or a salty type of person? Do you go for crisps or do you go for chocolate when you're stressed or bored or tired? So just have a think about that. And if you're happy to share in the chat, just, it doesn't have to be you personally, but just sort of things in general that you notice when either you're stressed or maybe when you're bored or maybe when you're tired, you tend to find yourself having. So we've got someone put in the chat, savory nibbles, definitely. I crave salty foods, when I'm stressed. Does anyone do more sweet though? Does anyone, get out the ice cream tub? Savory, not sweet. Yep, savory. Oh, we got quite a lot of savory in the chat. Sweet always. Okay, yep. Does anyone notice maybe when you're bored or if you're watching like a scary film, you might notice that you're eating more popcorn more quickly because of that sort of excited, suspenseful feel you might have. Or maybe when you're bored, you just tend to sort of graze, you're just kind of like grazing at the table and picking different snacks. Yeah, so everyone kind of has a personal taste, but in general, from kind of a physiological perspective, there's a little bit of rationale to that. So when we're tired, specifically when we're fatigued, we'll dive into this a little bit more detail later, but when we're fatigued, our body is, we're sleep deprived, our brain is trying to fire at all cylinders, but it hasn't got that energy source it needs from foods. And so our brain predominantly sort of relies on quick energy, to fuel it. And that tends to come from carbohydrates. When I say carbohydrates, I mean breads, crisps, rice, any sorts of foods really. And that tends to be sometimes where we might sort of find we go for those crisps or, other sort of carb-based food items that give us a sense of enjoyment as well, because our brain is sort of saying, I need carbohydrates so I can get really quick energy. And also from kind of a psychological level, these foods bring me comfort. It's going to boost my serotonin levels. So I just need to get this food quickly in me. So it's, again, we want to, this presentation is sort of in two prongs. We want to recognize that our mood, when we're stressed, when we're bored, when we're tired, our mood is going to impact some of those food choices that we make. If you're tired, are you going to make a really lengthy, complex dinner? No, you're probably going to might order a takeaway. So it's recognizing those things while equally recognizing that our food choices will also impact how we're feeling as well. So there's this interconnected relationship and they swing in both ways. So just a little note about emotional eating. There's a couple of things. I'm just going to show it all on one slide for a second. When it comes to that sort of live to eat mentality, that sort of side where we recognize the pleasure and enjoyment that comes from eating, sometimes in sort of our society, it can get a bit of a bad rep. So while we want to acknowledge that food can be comforting, and that comfort eating can be part of our sort of toolkit of coping resources and coping mechanisms, it's something that we don't necessarily want to just have. We won't want it to be the only sort of tool or skill that we have in our arsenal of kind of coping mechanisms. We want to just sort of look at it as one extra to sort of a range of different sort of coping mechanisms that we can have, like being active, doing deep breathing exercises when we're stressed and so on, things like that. So food can be emotionally comforting, because it is, particularly because when we have certain foods, it can increase the chemical called serotonin in our brains, and that's sort of linked to, feeling good. And that's specifically kind of found oftentimes with carbohydrates, but you can find it in lots of sort of connections to food that way as well. well. But sometimes, like I said, when we're eating, we can manage sometimes it can lead into we're managing our emotions rather than our hunger levels. So comfort eating is something that we all experience, but it doesn't mean that it should be kind of the only coping mechanism that we should have in our arsenal, basically. And if we find that we're starting to identify that it's might actually be getting to a point where we're overeating or overindulging and it's starting to be a detriment to our health, then that's when we want to sort of be aware of that, this connection that we have to food and our relationship with food, and sort of take a beat to say, do I feel like I'm relying on this particular kind of coping mechanism a bit too much? So I need to look at maybe other options. So part of that can be, practicing more mindful eating techniques. It can be being mindful of just how are you feeling in the moment? Am I picking this snack up because I'm actually hungry? Or am I picking this snack up because I'm stressed and I want to eat that? I've had a previous dietitian tell me that she always did a litmus test where she would ask her clients to sort of pick a food that they were neutral about. So they didn't hate it, but they also weren't grabbing it off the shelf right away. So she said for her it was carrots, right? And so she would kind of ask herself sometimes, am I eating for hunger or am I eating for comfort? And if she wasn't eating, so she would ask herself, well, if I was hungry, then I would be willing to eat carrots right now because I don't love them or hate them, but they're there and I need energy because I'm hungry, so I'm going to have them. But if it was more of a comfort eating cue, then she'd be like, no, I don't really want carrots. That's not going to satisfy me. I want, this chocolate bar. I want these crisps. And so that was kind of a good litmus test for her and her clients to sort of ask, oh, okay, is this how I can distinguish? But another way is just, again, being aware, taking that beat for a second to think, do I actually want this? Am I actually hungry? Am I noticing any sort of other hunger cues, like my stomach growling? Or, I notice I know, from the timing I haven't eaten today, so I should be physically hungry. Or am I kind of eating from the heart? Am I eating just for comfort and those sorts of things? But now we're going to further kind of the other part of the presentation is to focus on how our food choices can then also impact our mood. So there are certain nutrients, like we said, that are found in certain food groups that can contribute to maintaining and balancing our mood throughout the day. The good news is, though, you don't have to take, a special supplement or a specific food. A lot of these nutrients you would normally have in a normal healthy diet, in a balanced nutrient dense diet, by following the Eat Well Guide, which is sort of the UK adults kind of recommendations for how to eat a sort of healthy diet throughout the day, throughout the week. So what's useful about the Eat Well Guide, and this, I know you probably won't see it in depth with the image there, but you can roughly make out sort of the colors and the categories of them. And sort of the green one being fruits and vegetables, aiming for that 5, portions of fruit and veg per day. The yellow category being our carbohydrates. So again, that's our breads, our rice, our pastries, all those sorts of things. And then sort of the pink section is our protein. Blue is calcium or calcium-rich foods, and then the small section is fats. So when we think about that, it could be, you can use the Eat Well Guide in a couple of different ways. You could either look at trying to have your dinner plate or your lunch plate kind of mimic those proportions. It can be more just a average of those sort of amounts throughout your day or throughout your week. So it's more about kind of just using it as a frame of reference there. But like we said, there are certain nutrients that can impact our mood. So we're going to start with carbohydrates first. So when I mean carbohydrates, like I say, it's all the good things, right? It's our breads, it's our rice, it's all the good tasty foods that we enjoy. But how does carbohydrates actually affect our brain specifically, and then as a knock-on effect, our mood? Well, just as a bit of context, our brain makes up about 2% of our total body weight, but it uses 20% of our energy throughout the day. So 20% of our calories that we need in a day is just to get our brain to function throughout the day. So it uses a significant amount. And like we said, carbohydrates is all about the sort of main energy source for the brain. And that's because unlike sort of proteins or fats, carbohydrates are sort of the simplest for our body to digest and convert into glucose, which is sort of the main currency of energy, if you will, for our brain. So when we talk about that sort of carbohydrates converting into glucose, sometimes you might hear about blood sugar. Is anyone sort of familiar? Blood glucose, blood sugar. So that's what they're referencing. So we need a range of different carbohydrates, as we saw in that Eat Well Guide image. But sometimes what can happen throughout the day is we might have carbohydrates that are known as simple carbohydrates, and that's things that tend to be they tend to be white in color. So it's your white breads rather than your wholemeal breads. It can be sort of just any sort of like basic carbohydrate, whether that's flour. If you're baking with something, that's rather than a whole grain flour that you're using, you are probably often using just a bleached, all-purpose flour. That's, a simple carbohydrate in a nutshell. So it's those sorts of things that can be simple, and they get converted really, really quickly and digested really, really quickly. So much so that they can cause this sort of spike in our blood sugar. And then we can have this sort of crash and burn, shortly after. So when we have these sort of low periods of low blood sugar or low blood glucose in our bloodstream, we don't really have enough fuel to keep us going. That's when you might sort of feel a bit cranky. You might notice it's just a bit foggy. You're trying to sort of concentrate and struggling. And that's when we start to notice some of these mood changes. So when it comes to carbohydrates, we specifically want to focus around eating what's called complex carbohydrates. And that's your whole grains, your whole certain grains of rice, pretty much anything that's going to be brown in general. So if you were having pasta, looking for the whole grain pasta rather than the normal refined pasta. Starchy potatoes, those sorts of things, normal breads with wholemeal, all those sorts of things are more complex. And what we mean by complex is that they just take longer for our body to digest, and they don't cause that big spike in our blood sugar, leaving us with very little fuel and impacting our mood. So when we do have, foods that are just really simple to digest, they can start to have this sort of really big increase in our blood sugar, and then we have that crash, and then that's when we can see some of these mood changes here, like feeling anxious or feeling irritable and grumpy. Have we heard the saying hangry before? It's very much a real thing, and that difficulty concentrating. So this visual here hopefully lays it out just a little bit more in terms of what I was describing. I think what I'm going to try to do is I'll see if I can change my cursor. Oh yeah, I can do the laser pointer. Can everyone see the laser pointer on their end? Okay, cool. So this just sort of explains what I was trying to verbally say just a moment ago. So if we sort of imagine this chart as our, a chart of our blood sugar, known as our blood glucose levels, then we want to sort of ideally be in a certain range. So if you might know someone who has type 1 diabetes, or familiar with sort of diabetes as a health condition, you may have heard these sort of, oh, I need to stay within a certain range. Oh, my blood sugar is too low, it's out of range. This is sort of the range that they're talking about. And why you may not be diagnosed with diabetes, we all still have a blood sugar range that we want to sort of stay within. And that's sort of represented by these green dotted lines here. So in general, throughout our day, it will fluctuate depending on, the day. But let's imagine here this red line where we see there's this huge spike. That's sort of a representative. If we just had like something really pure sugar, like licorice, candy, sweets, something that's pretty much 90% sugar, right? If we consumed that, then that's sort of what this visual is describing here. We have this really big increase in blood sugar right away, but then it starts to really rapidly be digested and start to sort of have this crash here, sort of quite quickly after. Meanwhile, if we're having sort of some foods that, are those simple carbohydrates, and like I said, the sort of white breads or white pasta, those sorts of things, then that's sort of represented in this yellow line, where again, we get this spike. It's not as drastic as sort of, the pure sugar type of example, but it does sort of get us above that ideal range that we would like to see in our blood range or blood sugar range. And then we have that tapered falling off. The sweet spot is where we have more often those complex carbohydrates, where it gives us the fuel that we need for our day. It doesn't spike our blood sugar too much, but it does give us that smaller spike to kind of, again, keep us going, keep us, fueled throughout the day, while staying within that ideal range. Does anyone have any questions about that? Is there anything that you need any clarifying before I move on? All right, well then I'll keep moving forward then. Let me go ahead and turn off the laser pointer. But yeah, so that's a bit about carbohydrates now, but now we're going to look at a couple of other nutrients that also impacts our mood. So magnesium it's a mineral, so we have vitamins and minerals. Magnesium falls into the mineral category, and essentially it turns the food that we eat into energy. So it's one of those it's a really important mineral. It makes sure that our parathyroid glands, which produce hormones, that help our bone health, it helps work normally. So there are some certain, again, like we said, there are a range of foods. You don't have to eat one particular food or take one certain supplement. If you're eating a sort of varied diet, the nutrient-dense diet, and following the Eat Well guide, you should be able to sort of meet these amounts, that are required or recommended for adults. But just some general good sources of magnesium is spinach, nuts, wholemeal bread, and in general, I've listed sort of the amounts because it's helpful to sort of say, here's what you should eat, but we hopefully want to know a bit of a guidance of how much. So there are different recommendations for men and women. So for men, it's around 300 micrograms a day, and then 270 for women. There's also another nutrient called vitamin B3. Is anyone familiar with that one? It's also seen as niacin on the back of food labels, and it's been sort of enriched, or niacin has been added into primarily our carbohydrate-based foods, into our flours for a number of years now, because ages ago we used to not get enough, but nowadays most people are good at getting it. But it's a really important vitamin. It helps the body release the energy from food, and it helps keep our nervous system and our skin healthy. So we want to make sure we're getting some good sources of niacin throughout our day. There are technically two forms, but just for the purposes of this sort of talk, in general, we can get both of those types of niacin from certain food groups, and that's things like meat, fish. For those that are plant-based, again, it's mostly niacin has been added into flours and things, into sort of cereals for a number of years now. So you can get it through that and through wheat flour or eggs as well. And again, there's different sort of recommendations for men and women. So it's about 16.5 for men and about 13.2 for women. Then we've got another nutrient called zinc. So zinc is really helpful with making new cells and enzymes. It helps to process carbohydrates, fat, and protein into food. And it's also helpful and important with wound healing as well. So again, we want to make sure we're getting a range of sort of food groups in our diet throughout our day, throughout our week, that help have good sources of zinc. And that's things like meat, shellfish, dairy foods, like your cheeses and whatnot. But before choosing those, just try to choose the low-fat ones. And certain bread products as well will be sort of enriched with it. Things like wheat germ. And again, slightly different variations for the amount that we're needed per day for men and women. So for men, we can see it's 9.5, and then for women, it's about 7. And then next up, so folate or folic acid, you might have heard those, especially if anyone sort of was pregnant and was taking like a prenatal vitamin. So folate is really important. It's a B vitamin found in a lot of foods. And then if you've heard of folic acid, that's kind of the man-made form of folate. Essentially, it helps with a lot of functions. So it helps the body form healthy red blood cells. It reduces the risk of birth defects. So that's why it's really, it's often included in a lot of prenatal vitamins. And then you could actually sort of end up having a folate deficiency, sometimes known as folate deficiency anemia. But folate is only found in sort of a small amount of foods, but you can get it in things like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, or leafy green vegetables such as, cabbage and kale, spring greens, spinach, peas. You can get it in chickpea and kidney beans, liver, but again, try to avoid this during pregnancy. And then some breakfast cereals have been fortified with folic acid as well. So again, in terms of the amounts that we need, adults need about 200 micrograms of folate a day. But it's also important to note that our body doesn't have long-term stores to store folate in our body. So we need to just eat it regularly. So that's just important to be aware of as well. And then finally, we've got sort of two other ones. So for selenium, again, it's another food group that is impacted by, or it can impact our mood. It can make us feel irritable. It can make us feel anxious. It can make us feel depressed. So it's those sorts of things that we want to be aware of and making sure that we're getting foods rich in selenium and then vitamin C as well. So I've got a video. I'm now nervous if it's going to play. So we shall see. But then maybe Grace, you can tell me if you can hear it through your speakers, or maybe if I need to change the settings. So we'll give it a go and see. Fabulous.
Yeah, that's fine, Catherine.
Okay, cool. Any comments about the video or anything that was surprising to you? Any questions? If you do have any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll kind of finish up our last sort of sections before we head off for the day. So we've talked a lot about the nutrients in actual food groups, but it's also really important, to think about what we're drinking as well. So when it comes to hydration, the typical recommendation is to drink anywhere between sort of 6 to 8, glasses or drinks per day. That's kind of, your average tea mug, that sort of size. The good news as well, when it comes to that recommendation for 6 to 8 kind of glasses per day, that can count water. It can count teas and coffees throughout the day. It can count smoothies, juices, those sorts of things. It doesn't count alcohol. And within those things, the other question we get is caffeine. But sort of first off is if we're not getting those 6 to 8 drinks per day, then we can really start to have some of that brain fog. We can have headaches. So sometimes we might think of headaches of we've just got a lot on our plate, but also sometimes it might just be need to drink a bit more water. And the other way to test as well, if your headache is, hydration linked, to sort of look at your urine color. If it's really bright yellow or even dark yellow, that means you're already dehydrated. So we want to make sure that we're sort of drinking plenty throughout the day, and then making sure that, we drink so that we're full. So again, sometimes we can mistake dehydration for hunger. So as well, it's just keeping that in mind. And then also just making sure we're kind of having, drinks throughout the day regularly. So that I forgot to mention, it does also include, milk and other dairy products as well. So that's useful to know. And then also, like I said, drinks, herbal teas. So the thing about caffeine that I'll sort of talk about, because that tends to be the question we get at this stage in the presentation, is how much caffeine can I have before it starts to, we know caffeine is a stimulant. That's why we might have it in our teas and coffees to keep us alert. But sometimes people can be either more or less sensitive to caffeine's effects. So caffeine can have what's known as sort of a half-life in our body. It can take a while to sort of digest. And so the typical sort of cutoff period for the general adult should be around sort of, 2 to 3 p.m. Because that caffeine can have a half-life and kind of keep going until around 8 to 9 p.m. even. So you can have caffeine throughout the day, but just sort of think about possibly switching over to a decaf version as you get into your evening, especially if you find you're quite sensitive to caffeine, if it's keeping you alert when you're trying to go to bed. And in terms of the amount of caffeine, again, for most adults, you can have around sort of 4 cups, 4 normal sizes of tea or coffee. Tea is roughly sort of 75, milligrams per cup. Coffee's around 100, but roughly 4 a day to stay within the kind of recommendations for caffeine. Let's see. And then the next sort of thing to keep aware of is just general sort of top tips. So we've talked a lot about kind of theory, and I think sometimes we need to establish some of that background knowledge first. But now we want to sort of think around, what can we do about it? So in general, some of our top tips is looking at sort of reducing the consumption of those really, the refined sugary foods, those simple carbohydrates, and kind of opting more for your starchy foods, your complex carbohydrates. So again, your kind of whole grain, your whole grain pastas versus and whole grain breads and those sorts of things. We want to look at combining some of those carbohydrates as well with the protein and healthy fats. So like the TED Talk video shared, we're made up of lots of different nutrients. So if we can combine these through the normal Eat Well Guide meal, where we're getting, those sources of omega-3s and 6s that we need to get from foods, our body can't produce them. And we're making sure we're getting some of those, leafy vegetables that contain some of those minerals and things. We can combine it all together, and that also helps. Also making sure that we're eating smaller portions at set intervals throughout the day. So especially, I used to be a person that didn't need to eat breakfast. I was fine. I wouldn't eat until sort of the middle of the day. But actually, what I found was I was really, really hungry by the time I got to the lunchtime, or by the time I, got to dinner, whenever your main meal is. And so I was ending up kind of overeating that amount to the point where I would feel quite uncomfortable. I felt really bloated and those sorts of things. Whereas we saw with that kind of graph with the blood sugar and the blood glucose levels, if I'm eating throughout the day, that helps to avoid some of those really big spikes. So having those regular meals and good, regular amounts of portions throughout the day can be helpful as well, and help make sure that our mood doesn't start to be impacted where we start to feel uncomfortable or just, lethargic and those sorts of things. And then, as I said, there's no, if the biggest takeaway I can recommend from this topic is that there's no one, magical supplement or magical food group or brain boosting food, there's none of those sorts of things. It's just about eating the rainbow. As a former dietitian I used to work with said, if we're eating the rainbow, it means we're eating lots of different colors of food, and that means we're getting different nutrients as well. So it's eating a varied and balanced diet. And then planning your meals. So again, as we saw, sometimes when we're stressed or bored or tired, our food choices are going to be very different because they're influenced by our mood. So if we're actually kind of trying to plan out our meals, if I say, okay, no, I've got parents' evening this week, it's going to be a really late night, let me sort of plan what I'm going to pack for my lunch the next day. So that way I'm not just sort of running on empty by the time I get to the evening, and then I'm just ordering a takeaway when I get home because it's the quickest, simplest thing, right? So we want to plan our meals throughout the day and throughout the week. And then finally making sure that we're staying hydrated throughout the day as well. And if you do have caffeine in sort of an excess amount, kind of more than 4 cups a day, then it might be helpful to sort of look at how we can cut down. If we can alternate, start to switch to decaf varieties and those sorts of things as well. So now, as we get towards the end, I just wanted to sort of do a bit of a practice. So again, I know sort of today's topic was a lot of theory. We need to know the context of how these things, how our food choices impact our mood, how our mood impacts our food choices. But then how can, from a behavior change point of view, how can we look to sort of make some changes around that and implement some of those tips that we just gave? So I think in the chat, someone earlier said, oh, you do a curry night on Fridays, and my family does that as well. I think quite a lot of families in the UK tend to do that. So I think I might take that as an example of, if let's say we were planning a curry for a dinner for our family, we wanted to combine some of these different food groups. How might we go about that? So if I said pick a carbohydrate that would go into a curry, whether that's, well, I don't want to give it away. So if I just put it in the chat, if I give that question to you, what would be a carbohydrate that is a complex carbohydrate that we could add into our meal if we were planning a curry? I can't talk today. Does anyone have any ideas? You can either just unmute yourself or you can just put it in the chat. What sort of carbohydrates that are complex could we add? So we've got chickpeas. Yeah, that's a good, I wasn't even thinking about that. It's a really great idea. Yeah, we've got a lentil curry. Yeah, so lentils are, both chickpeas and lentils are a great sort of example of how they're sort of a complex carbohydrate, but also they're a really good source of protein as well, especially if you're plant-based. I've got someone put sweet, maybe they meant, sweet potatoes. Oh, yes. Yeah, so sweet potatoes, they're an interesting one. So potatoes count as a starchy food. They count as a carbohydrate, but actually because of the sort of nutritional profile of a sweet potato, they fall into a vegetable. So that's just another good distinction there. Yeah, so depending on what type of beans you wanted to put in, yep, that could count. Other things, if you were making sort of a curry, you could have, maybe instead of white rice, you could do like a whole grain rice, or instead of maybe like poppadoms and naan bread and all these sorts of things, that would be quite a simple carbohydrate. You could either choose to have them in smaller amounts, like maybe just pick naan over a poppadom, or vice versa, or choose to have a mini naan size instead of a whole one, especially if you're having rice with it. It's just sort of things like that, but you guys are on the right page. So this is really good. So we've started our carbohydrate. Let's say we're going to go for, we had 2 people do lentils. Let's say we're going to do a lentil curry, and we're going to have some whole grain rice on the side. That sound good to everyone? Someone's put in the chat, is an onion bhaji a food group? So yeah, onion bhaji is delicious, not necessarily its own food group. It's kind of a vegetable because it's an onion, but because it's fried, it kind of falls outside the Eat Well guide as a category of foods to enjoy in smaller amounts. So everything in moderation, right? So again, you can sort of choose if you're making this curry, you could have your kind of more plant-based curry, get your vegetables and proteins and things that you need, and then if you still wanted to have that on the side, you could have it as a, in moderation. But yeah, so I think we've actually sort of picked out a protein by having lentils or having chickpeas. But if we wanted to sort of look at a different protein, is there any other ideas that we could come up with? It's not sounding good already. What about for sort of for our vegetables? So we saw a lot of those, if you remember some of those vitamin and minerals, they sort of mentioned that they came in certain food groups that would fall into sort of the vegetable category. Can anyone think of any sort of, like vegetables that we could add in addition to our lentil curry? Someone's put, yeah, sagaloo, potato, and spinach. So yeah, so potato could be one of our simple carbohydrates if we wanted to have it. And then spinach, yeah, that's a really great source of a couple of those different minerals that we talked about. Kale's another one. Yep. Yeah, so yeah, you guys are getting the hang of it. So it's all these sorts of things. Oh, someone's put cauliflower as a side dish somewhere. I love doing some roasted cauliflower with like turmeric and cayenne pepper on the side. It's always really good. Spinach, yep. Yeah, so you guys are hitting the nail on the head. So we want to think about shaping our meals. There's nothing incredibly rare or very unique to find in some of the ingredients that you guys have suggested. And hopefully you're seeing some of the beauty in that is that we don't have to have a fancy pill or a fancy supplement to get a lot of these mood boosting nutrients that we need throughout our day, right? We can pick a lentil curry, have some whole grain rice on the side, add some spinach or kale to it. And then if we, want either chicken or want to keep it a plant-based curry, we can do that. So hopefully that gives you a bit of idea of how you can start to pair things together. And then just in general ideas, throughout the day. If you're having a sandwich at lunch, could it be a whole grain bread versus a white bread? Or could you start small and look at, swapping over to maybe 50-50 bread? If we wanted some good sources of omega-3s, omega-6s, we could look at sort of fish products. So we could do like a salmon, those sorts of things. And like we said, the curry as well. So as we summarize, I know we're coming to the end, so just quickly, I'm going to put in the chat. There we go. So in the chat, I've just put the satisfaction survey. So if you can have a quick click on it and just sort of have it open on the side, and then you can complete it at the end. I'd really appreciate it as I wrap up our summary. So like we said, there's a lot to sort of cover in this topic, but hopefully it was useful to you. And in general, the key sort of takeaway message that we'd like to say is that having regular meals that contain those complex carbohydrates along with some of those other nutrients throughout the day is going to help stabilize our energy and our mood. We want to sort of recognize that meals combining carbohydrates with those fats and proteins, like we just did with the curry example, can help us to provide sort of steady blood glucose levels. So we're not, we're avoiding getting those really big blood sugar spikes and then that crash. And then having convenient, healthy foods at hand can make it easier to make those healthy food choices. So like we said, if we know we're in a stressful period of life, if we know we're really tired, if we know we're bored, then we're going to gravitate to some of these sorts of certain food groups. And again, while that's not a bad thing, we want to make sure that we're not becoming overly reliant as well. So it's thinking about that, planning ahead, even just small things like maybe I put the snacks, my sweet and salty snacks that I go to when I'm stressed, outside of eyesight, so outside of your countertops and putting them at the top shelf of a cupboard. So that way it's not just sort of your default. I have to sort of do a little bit of work to grab them. Those sorts of kind of consumer psychology tips can help as well. And then having that diverse, balanced, nutrient-dense diet is helpful to make sure we're getting all the nutrients we need to help prevent some of these symptoms of when our mood starts to really be impacted. And then understanding that relationship that both our mood can help us with our food choices and equally vice versa, so we can find sort of better solutions to help our well-being. So like I said, I think Grace has done a fantastic job of answering questions along the way. Have I missed anything, Grace?
I think I've covered them, but if you've got any extra info, we had a question about foods to avoid before bed. And we also had a question on how to make the curry less oily.
Okay, yeah, so I'll answer this question about the bed first, or about going to bed. So in general, when it comes to falling asleep, especially if you have difficulty falling asleep because maybe you have an upset stomach or you feel really bloated, the general practice, general recommendations is to avoid having really heavy foods, so things that are quite high in fats and quite high in protein, and that's because they take longer for our body to digest. That's also not solely, protein and fat-rich foods can do that. Also, regardless of whatever we're eating, if we're eating excessive amounts of it or really, larger portions of a food, then that can also impact the sort of bloated, lethargic feeling that you have, which can make it harder to fall asleep. So in general, the recommendation is just to, have your dinner, things that have the complex carbohydrates, the proteins and the good sources of fat in them, but try to avoid, having them so close to when you're going to bed. So at least kind of 2 and a bit hours before you're going to bed is the general recommendation. Everyone's a bit unique, so that you're not feeling way too, heavy and your body has had time to digest it before we go asleep. Because when we fall asleep, our brain starts to deprioritize digestion. We slow down how quickly we digest when we're sleeping. So that helps. Hopefully that answers your question. If you have any follow-up, just put it in the chat. And then what was the other question? To how was it something
Just
oily?
about if you're cooking a curry, we had a question, is it all very oily? And I suggested maybe cooking from scratch or using a spray which has less lower calories than lots of oil.
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, that pretty much hits the nail on the head. The other thing I'll say is think about the type of fat you're using when cooking. So with the curry, if you're cooking something in sort of like extra virgin olive oil or, certain oils that are typically, rule of thumb, if it's like a plant-based oil like sunflower oil, avocado oil, olive oil, they are part of those sources of good fats, as we would call them, within moderation, that have those omega-3s and 6s in them. So again, it's still about you don't want to, in excess eat really oily foods, but they kind of do contribute to the amount of fats that we would be looking for. While equally, like you said, if you wanted to sort of look at how much we're using, regardless of whether it's a good or kind of bad fat, then we can use sort of sprays or other things to look at how we can sort of reduce the amount of oil that's in there. Does that answer your question? And as always, if you do have any other questions, you can send a follow-up or just unmute yourself if you're able to. But yeah, what I'll go ahead and do again. Yeah, you can use slow cooker. Yeah, definitely. So yeah, so that's kind of our presentation now. So in terms of next steps, what I'll do is for everyone that's attended, I think everyone should have sort of accepted it, which means I'll have your email address. So after probably tomorrow, I'll have some time to send you all the recording as well as the PowerPoint slide deck from today's session, and then some extra resources with recipe ideas and the Eat Well guide if you want to explore that in more detail. But I think that's everything today. So we'll stick around if you do have any other questions. Otherwise, I look forward to hopefully welcome you at a future webinar. And then if you haven't done so already, then I've just re-put the survey in at the bottom so you can complete it then. But thank you so much for your time, everyone.
Thank you very much, Catherine and Grace.